So thank you, both of you, for coming. You'll notice, if you're watching the Real Truth About Health conference, that we have a panel every night at 7 o'clock. And we either have 4, 5, 6, or 7 people on it. This panel only has 2 people, and there's a reason. And the reason is that there are hundreds of authors to choose from who speak about whole food, plant-based diet, and there's a tremendous amount that speak about climate change and the environment. There's not as much information circulating, or as many books or as many authors focusing on antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So I'm very grateful that we were able to have both of these speakers here tonight, and that they've chosen to take their time and effort to focus on a topic that I believe is very worthy of everyone's time. So to get started, the first question I want to ask both of you is, there's a lot of people who are busy, they're reading all kinds of things, and we don't always get that much information on this topic. I get 4 newspapers at home, the New York Post, Newsday, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. And every day they talk about the stock market, the Trump investigation, they used to talk about Hillary's emails, there's a lot of things talked about, and I think it's very much the exception if I ever read anything about antibiotic-resistant bacteria. Does this mean that we should assume that this is a secondary topic, not of significant health concern, not very important because it's not written about, it's not on the news that often? Why are you taking your time to write books about it and speaking about it and devoting all this energy when I kind of don't read about it that much in the mainstream press? So what is your thoughts?
So, as a former newspaper reporter, first, let me thank you for subscribing to all those newspapers. It's very important, and today more than ever, that journalism be kept healthy. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. So, the former Secretary General of the United Nations has called antibiotic resistance the greatest and most urgent global risk. The Chief Medical Officer of the United Kingdom has compared its threat to society to as serious as terrorism. The former head of the CDC here in the US talks about resistant bacteria with phrases like nightmare bacteria. The annual toll of death around the world is supposed to be 350,000 deaths a year, predicted to go up to 10 million deaths a year if we don't change the trend of drug-resistant infections. But what I find, and I'm really interested to hear David's point of view as well, is that drug-resistant infections are a kind of a stealth problem. And that's partly because when they occur, they are so frightening that none of us can really empathize with them. None of us want to think of ourselves as someone who's devastated in an intensive care unit, or as the parent of a child who's died suddenly of drug-resistant staph pneumonia. It's so terrifying that it's a thing that I think we kind of push away from ourselves. And maybe we in the media haven't done enough to publicize it, though goodness knows I'm trying my hardest. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. That's definitely a part of it. I think there's other factors too. I think it's enormously hard to explain what it's about. So even if somebody does have a loved one who dies, oftentimes maybe they're not told the details about the resistant infection. They might know that their family member, their organs shut down, or they had blood infection, septicemia, both of which can be due to a resistant organism, but that's not how people in hospitals might talk about it. Of course, the other problem is that I've tried, and I can't explain the problem in 140 characters. I don't know about you.
The thing that you just said is really interesting to me, because, if you've ever had the misfortune to have a family member who goes to the hospital and is in the hospital and has a procedure or has care that they're billed for. When you get the bill, there's certain codes that indicate everything that happened to your person, what their diagnosis was, what was done to them, and so forth. There are no codes for antibiotic-resistant infections, and antibiotic-resistant infections are not reported on death certificates. So it's actually hard to find out. You might, as David has just said, have someone who's had a drug-resistant infection in your family, someone who's incurred that in the hospital or caught it in the outside world and was made sick by it, but you might not know it from their health paperwork. It's not something that we do a good job of surfacing in healthcare.
Right, right. I think the other thing about the media is that media-friendly stories are fast disasters, really overwhelming things that happen quickly. This is not that. This is a disaster sort of in several decades in the making, like some other things that are pretty prominent now. And so it's a little bit like, the iceberg floating in the North Atlantic. And we're on the Titanic, and we're getting closer and closer. And I guess some of us have already hit the iceberg, but the rest of us are in the ship just behind the Titanic, hoping that we don't hit it too.
Yeah, I like the idea of it being a mass disaster in slow motion.
So what exactly is the problem if an antibiotic doesn't work? I mean, if an antibiotic doesn't work, can you just rest and eat a little healthier and, and just be slowed down? Or we live in a world, we've grown up in a world where there are antibiotics. What are the consequences? Like, what % of the time does an antibiotic not work lead to death or something terrible? And what % of the time, it's how bad is it if we don't have antibiotics that work?
That's a harder question to answer. I don't know if one can quantify the percentage of the time. I'll say this. There's a certain amount of unknown to all this, right? But that's true of many diseases that affect us. You prepare as best you can, but it's unknowable. What you can do, though, is people that really need antibiotics definitely should not shy away from taking them. If your physician says, or your healthcare provider says, you really need an antibiotic, I wouldn't question that. But quite the reverse is true if somebody's telling you you don't need an antibiotic. Because the fact of the matter is one of the impacts of resistant bacteria being out there is that if you take an antibiotic, and there's bacteria around in your environment, in your body that are resistant to that antibiotic, you're more likely to get an infection. So you could be healthy and take an antibiotic for something like an ear problem or a sinus infection. It's not going to kill you, but you thought you needed an antibiotic, but you could end up with a much worse infection, a much more worse resistant infection just by virtue of you taking that antibiotic. So it just underscores the idea that one thing you can do is only take antibiotics when you really, really need them.
This idea that maybe we don't need antibiotics, and maybe there are infections where if we didn't take antibiotics, they would resolve on their own, is a really interesting idea to me. So let me tell you a story about what happens when antibiotics aren't available. In 1938, my grandfather's younger brother, who was my grandfather's family are from the Rockaways, not very far from here. My grandfather's younger brother was a fireman in Manhattan. And on his day off, he was hanging out at the firehouse because he loved being a fireman and he wanted to be there all the time. And he was just kind of making himself useful around the firehouse, and a big, heavy chunk of metal, one of the fire hose nozzles, if you can imagine those big lengths of metal at the end of the fire hose, fell off one of the shelves that he was dusting and landed on his shoulder and bruised him and cut him up a little bit, but he wasn't seriously injured. And we would think probably, oh, that's the sort of thing for which you just go home and you just sleep it off and you maybe put on a cold compress, take some aspirin. So my great uncle went home to his brand new bride. They lived in Queens. And he started to spike a fever. And his shoulder started to hurt. And the fever got higher and higher and higher. And in 1938, which is before the start of the antibiotic era, there wasn't much that you could do for fever, which is a sign of infection, other than aspirin and ice baths, cold compresses. So they did all that, and it didn't work. And they took him to the hospital in the Rockaways near where my grandparents lived. And the fever got worse and worse and worse because there was nothing to hold the infection in check. Eventually, he developed what they called a blood poisoning and what we would consider now to be septic shock. And the only thing they had to treat him was that the men from his firehouse lined up to volunteer to give blood transfusions because they thought if they literally diluted his blood, it would make the blood poisoning less serious, and it didn't work. And he died at the age of 30 in 1938, 5 years before penicillin was licensed. So there are times, as David said, when we really need antibiotics, when antibiotics are the thing that ended the historic menace of infectious diseases, of infections that killed us. We may overuse antibiotics and take them when we don't need them, but there are times when we really need them, and antibiotic resistance takes them away.
So what type of things do we take for granted today that we just take an antibiotic and it resolves it, that if we didn't have antibiotics could be deadly? What are the common things that I'm not even thinking of where you use an antibiotic, it's no big deal, and that's the end of it, that if we didn't have antibiotics could lead to terrible outcomes like you just mentioned?
Surgery, childbirth, complicated dental procedures, cesarean sections, heart surgery, any kind of open cavity surgery, broken bones that break the skin. What am I missing?
Dialysis.
There we go, dialysis, anything that interrupts the protection of the skin.
Chemotherapy. Folks on both those things, I mean, they're long-term, but they're very vulnerable because their immune systems are suppressed.
Cancer chemotherapy,
right.
HIV, care after organ transplants,
Yep.
after joint transplants, heart valves. Yeah. So most of modern medicine is supported by the use of antibiotics. And if we lost them, those are the things we'd lose as well.
Animal bites.
Good one.
Trauma victims. You know, if you're in a car accident, you're all cut up. None of those things that could cut you are sterile. So there's a pretty high presumption that if you start developing problems, it's likely that you're getting an infection. Same with somebody in the battlefield. A lot of dirt and just stuff in your wound. They try to debride it, which in addition to being very painful, it's impossible to get everything out of the wound that you would want to avoid infection. So one might look at that last example and say, geez, it sounds like this should be a really big deal, a really huge concern for the Pentagon, for national security, for the Defense Department, and it is. But we don't hear as much about that, and we should, I think.
Aren't there a lot of antibiotics? So if you're resistant to the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, why don't they just give them the sixth one? If you're resistant to the sixth, not give them the seventh. There's so many different ones. Why not just go on to the next one if you're resistant to the first 5 or 6?
Well, I'll give you an example. When I was in training, so you're an intern, right? You're kind of learning the ropes. You're in the hospital, and people in the hospital are sick. They often spike fevers. The first thing you used to do is to draw blood for cultures. So you draw the blood, you send it down to the laboratory, and then you wait. there's a period of time before the culture comes back where you don't know what you're treating. So you try that one antibiotic, and let's say you don't get the cultures back until the next morning. Well, gee, it was resistant to that antibiotic. Then what do you do? So hopefully the next one you try is one that your culture has shown to be sensitive, but in fact, that might take additional time because you have to do something called sensitivities, and that shows you what antibiotics that thing that grew out on the culture actually was sensitive to. I guess the good news is that labs are developing techniques to get that information back to the doctor or the nurse more quickly than they used to. So we're speeding up that time factor, but there still is a time factor. And if you're really, really sick and you're septic, things can change for you in a matter of hours, not days. So you just run out of time. And that's when people die, sometimes that's what happens. It's not like the bug that they had was completely resistant to everything. It's that they ran out of time to try everything.
So in terms of this question about antibiotic-resistant bacteria, what is the actual time frame we're talking about? Are we saying that in 20 years we're going to run out of it, in 25 years, in 5 years? I mean, what is the time frame where you can go to a doctor or you can go to get antibiotics and there'd be no antibiotics to treat you with? You would be your issue would be resistant to all the antibiotics that exist. What kind of time frame do you think we're in?
Well, for some infections, the time is now. There are already infections moving around the world, and some of them have occurred here in the United States, for which no antibiotic works anymore. For others, maybe we're 5 years away, or 10 or 20. I want to go back to the thing we were talking about just a moment ago, about sort of how you run through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 antibiotics. So what antibiotic resistance is, it's simply bacteria, disease bacteria, learning to defend themselves against antibiotics which are sent at them to kill them. So the first antibiotic, for instance, was penicillin. Released to the military in 1943, came on the open market in 1944. First resistance in hospitals appeared in 1947. Moved around the world, came to the United States in the 1950s. So to defeat resistance in penicillin, pharmaceutical companies took the molecule at the center of penicillin that bacteria had already learned to defend themselves against and kind of tinkered with it a little bit and came up with a drug called methicillin. That's the M in MRSA, drug-resistant staph, MRSA. Resistance to methicillin arrived in a year. So for every drug, for every drug sent at bacteria to kill them, there's been an adaptation in the bacteria that leapfrogs them ahead of the drug. And then we come up with a new drug, and then bacteria learn to defend themselves again. It's either a game of leapfrog or a game of whack-a-mole, where things keep coming up where you don't expect them and you have to smack them down. But the way that bacteria spread, one way that bacteria spread resistance is by having descendant bacteria that inherit that resistance. The other way moves even faster, but let's stick with inheritance for a minute. Bacteria can have a new generation in 20 minutes. It takes 10 to 15 years to develop a new antibiotic. So in that game of leapfrog, we are always going to be behind the starting gun. They are always going to be ahead of us. That's one reason why it's really, really important to conserve antibiotics and use them carefully, is because if we use them up and we have to come up with new drugs, we will never get in front of the bugs fast enough.
Let me talk about the food industry for a minute. What is different about a chicken we eat today in 2019 versus a chicken we ate 100 years ago?
It grows to twice the weight in half the time. The chicken in our grandparents' or great-grandparents' backyard would have been skinny and upright and probably colored feathered. And very active. It would have, if it was a hen, it would have chased its chicks around the yard. It would have been able to fly up into trees in order to evade predators or the family dog. The chicken we eat today, and they would have been only about maybe 2-3 pounds. The chickens we eat today are 5 to 6 pounds when they're slaughtered. They're always white-feathered. They are a docile, slow-moving block of protein with a profound appetite that gets to their full slaughter weight in 42 days. The chickens that we eat in the United States are only 42 days old when they are killed, and they're considered adults. So in 100 years, we got from a bird that could feed itself, fly by itself, defend itself, and take care of its offspring, to a bird that can't have offspring, doesn't fly, doesn't know how to defend itself, and doesn't do much but kind of sit there and eat and sleep and wait, but not very long.
And, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I want to talk about the difference in what the chicken of 100 years ago eats compared to today's chicken. So, and feel free to pipe in, but I wasn't around 100 years ago, but I would imagine the chicken was out in the backyard scratching a lot of the time. What do they do when they're scratching? They're trying to scratch up bugs, sprouted seeds, basically anything they can find. They're foragers, so they have a very diverse diet. They were getting protein from different sources. And let's contrast that with what today's chickens eat. You want to pipe in?
Corn and soybeans?
Corn and soybeans, yes, that's a pretty good guess. So, you know, one thing we're really, really, really good at in this country is growing corn and soybeans, and that's not an accident. They're both incredibly efficient converters of sun into calories, and we were so good at it that there's an enormous abundance of it. In fact, you know, I just saw in the paper today that corn and soybean prices are going to be low for a long, long time because we have a glut of both of them. And we do lots of things with that corn and soybeans, but one probably the majority of it goes to feed animals now. It's not food we're growing, it's mostly animal feed for animals, and that includes chickens.
So what does chicken have to do with antibiotics?
So, as I found when I was researching that book that you so kindly waved around, thank you very much for having my book up there. So, we've been feeding antibiotics routinely to food animals since the late 1940s. In most countries, most meat animals get a dose of antibiotics on most days of their lives. And not because they're sick, but because enterprising biologists found out in the early days of the antibiotic era that giving really small doses of antibiotics to animals, much smaller than it would take to cure an infection, made them put on muscle mass more quickly, which meant you were producing an animal that you could sell faster than you would have otherwise. It also protected them against diseases, that if you got enthusiastic about how fast you were growing animals and packed more and more of them into barns and feedlots. Well, it happens that all of that was done first in chickens, that chickens were the animals that proved experimentally that you could give those tiny doses of antibiotics to an animal and come up with an animal that was quicker and cheaper to grow, which kind of began the process of turning animals from beings that lived in a barnyard into widgets on essentially an assembly line that moves faster and faster and faster all the time.
What is different about a cow we eat today versus a cow from 100 years ago?
I don't know that much about cows. How about you?
Well, cows are ruminants, right? That's the description of their stomach. They're called ruminant stomach, but it means a creature that is designed to take in plant biomass. You know, typically it would have been some kind of grass or hay, alfalfa, and take that cellulose and break it down so that the cow could use it for energy. That's what they were designed to do. What they were specifically not designed to eat was corn and soybeans. The pH of their stomach is not optimal for that. So what do we feed cows today by and large? Almost exclusively is corn and soybeans. And so that really changes the nature of the animal. It, like I said, it changes the pH of the stomach. And at one point there was evidence, for example, that that changing pH actually raised the likelihood of there being bacteria in the cow's stomach, certain kinds of bacteria that you don't want there. But another thing it does is it gives them abscesses in their livers. That's directly linked to what they eat now. They shouldn't be getting abscesses in their livers, but they do. In fact, it's so commonplace that much of the antibiotics given to cows on feedlots is for those liver abscesses, and they give them antibiotics so that they can keep them upright long enough to get to the slaughterhouse, because if you're got a lot of money invested in a cow, you don't want them dropping and you'll be out that investment, right? So in that case, you know, antibiotics and their use is directly related to what we feed or what cows eat.
So what is the link between the meat industry and the pork industry and antibiotic-resistant bacteria?
Do you want to go first?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So these doses of antibiotics that we feed routinely to animals to make them put on muscle mass faster, to protect them against diseases of crowding, they get into the animals in their feed, which means they're going into their gut. So how many people here have heard about the microbiome? Right? Yeah, I know this is a really educated audience about health. So the microbiome, the bacteria that live in us and on us. We have a gut microbiome. Every living being does. Those antibiotics disrupt the gut microbiome. That's probably why animals gain weight faster, is that the influence of the drugs changes the mix of bacteria in the gut such that they extract more nutrition from the feed they're getting. But what happens when those antibiotics arrive in the gut is the same as what happens to antibiotics anywhere else, to bacteria anywhere else that they're encountering antibiotics, is that some bacteria die and some survive. And they survive because they happen to have mutations that protect them against the attack of antibiotics. Those mutations are antibiotic resistance. So resistant bacteria survive against the antibiotics attack. They're in the gut of the animal. So one of two things is going to happen. Either they're going to leave the gut while the animal's alive, when the animals poop. Animal manure from feedlots is loaded with resistant bacteria. And then those resistant bacteria can leave the farm in storm runoff, in groundwater, as dust on the wind, on the feet of insects and rodents, on the skin and clothing of farm workers. Those bacteria leave the farm carrying their resistance DNA and then move through the environment on pathways that we really can't track. Or they contribute their DNA to other bacteria. So that's what happens while the animals are still living. But what if the animals are killed, which is what they're on the feedlot for, right? Is that they're there to be turned into meat. We take them to the slaughterhouse, we disassemble them from animals into meat, and at some point the contents of the gut, which contains those resistant bacteria, splashes on the meat. And those resistant bacteria travel on the meat that the animals become into home and restaurant kitchens, where they contaminate our kitchens. And if we don't cook the meat to the temperature of the surface of the sun, they survive so that we consume them. And in that case, they cause antibiotic-resistant foodborne illness, like Salmonella and E. coli, for instance. Every year, there are outbreaks of drug-resistant foodborne illness. I'm going to talk about one of them tomorrow morning in my talk. And they very clearly track back to the use of antibiotics on farms. So the short answer of the TLDR of that very long answer is that the problem with antibiotics used in the meat industry is that they push the development of drug-resistant bacteria on farms, which then leave farms in a variety of ways to threaten the health of people, not only who are meat eaters, but people who even have no connection to that farm, who are just happen to be living their lives in an environment where resistant bacteria can move around freely. How'd I do?
So that was great.
Thank you.
So I have a little different way of approaching that question. So what ties these industries together? You just heard a fantastic explanation from sort of a bacteria point of view, from a microbe point of view. Let's take a step back and look at communities and power, because that also ties them together. In all these industries, they are taking a very cheap feedstocks, corn and soybeans mostly, and it's cheap, by the way, because in part, you and I and the entire country has supported huge investments into those industries to make them cheap. That's why they're still cheap, but there's other reasons too, but that's a big one. So they're taking those very cheap feedstocks, and what are the big, where's the corn belt, the soybean belt? It's mostly in the middle of the country, but there's also some pretty significant grain production, for example, in parts of the eastern seaboard, near North Carolina, for example. It's widely grown, but it's definitely concentrated in a few areas. And in each case, those feed grains are the biggest expense for all these meat companies. And so they don't want to ship that grain any farther than they have to. So they locate these huge factory-style farms close to where the grains are. Now, there's still some differences. So for example, historically, Iowa's been where a lot of pigs were. There's also some cattle there, but it's really pig-dominated. Minnesota has pigs, but also turkeys. North Carolina's had mostly pigs, but an interesting thing happened there. At one point, things got so bad from the pollution that they put a moratorium on new pig farms, new pig factories, and so then the companies started moving turkey and chicken farms into the same communities. So what is it about these communities that makes them so attractive? Well, in some cases, it's because they're relatively depopulated. If you want to open up a huge beef feedlot or a huge dairy, they take up a lot of space. So you're going to look for a place, a part of the country where there just aren't many people. And so eastern Colorado, western Kansas, the panhandle of Oklahoma, these are big beef feedlots. Unfortunately, I think one of the factors in eastern North Carolina is that it was primarily African American. And there was an agricultural tradition there, but they are communities without a lot of political power. And they've been targeted, I think, is fair to say, for siting an awful lot of these large animal facilities in a very small amount of area. And that's kind of continued over the last, 40 or 50 years. And so some of these meat companies like Smithfield actually started off as family businesses, but they're so far beyond that now. They've gotten very, very large very, very quickly. And in both the chicken industry and the pork industry, there's just a few companies now that dominate the entire industrial sector. So, those are names that you mostly recognize. It's the Perdues and the Tysons and the Smithfields. And so they carry a lot of weight in the areas in which they operate. Now, what's interesting is some of those companies started off creating protein from chickens, but now they're looking for other proteins to create as well. And so I think if the trend lines hold true, you're going to see consolidation, and you're going to start seeing the same companies becoming involved, not just in pork, for example, but pork and beef, because they're buying the same feed, they're using the same basic techniques, They need the same kind of supply chains, so why not just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger?
If I buy fish to eat, if I go to a restaurant or a supermarket and buy fish, and it says that it's been farm raised, does that expose me to more antibiotics than if I got an ocean caught fish? And am I being exposed at all from this?
You might. It depends on where the fish is farmed, but there are certain areas where salmon is grown in pens, for instance, that salmon production depends highly on antibiotics. For instance, two nations that have very, very large salmon farming sectors are Chile and Norway. And recently, Chile had a grave national embarrassment because Costco, the big, the warehouse market, Costco stopped buying salmon from Chile and switched all its contracts to Norway because Norway was using fewer antibiotics in their salmon, and Costco knew that was what their consumers wanted. In the case of farmed shrimp from Southeast Asia, there isn't very much FDA inspection. We don't have anywhere near the number of inspectors that we need, but FDA examination of farmed shrimp has found all kinds of banned antibiotics and pesticides and really dangerous stuff, carcinogenic drugs in some cases, in farmed shrimp. So not eating a land animal doesn't necessarily protect you.
I just want to add one thing. The Costco example, it struck me that 20 years ago, and I think both Maryn and I have been working on this issue for 20 years in our respective fields, but 20 years ago...
Since I was 12.
20 years ago, if you had polled the public, antibiotic resistance in terms of food would not have been on their radar screen at all. But let me tell you, because of folks like us and you all, it's totally on the radar screen of food companies now. It's among the top things that consumers say they're concerned about, that they want to see reflected in the items that Costco serves, or Safeway or Kroger's or whoever. And so they're paying attention. And that's why Costco would take a rather significant step of completely switching their supply chain. It's because of the input of their ultimate consumers, which is you all.
It really is. I really believe that the reason, there's been some good news recently about antibiotic use in agriculture in the United States. Some sectors of the protein economy have ceased using, chicken has ceased using antibiotics substantially. Restaurant chains are turning over to antibiotic-free, and I really believe that's the power of the consumer. That if it were not for big buyers like hospital systems and school systems, but also individual buyers, individual people going to the customer service desk in their supermarket and saying, what is this on my packet of chicken? I don't want to see this here anymore. Bring us something else. The change that we're seeing now would not have happened without consumer pressure.
And actually, it's not just our guesswork. Several years ago, the Purdue leadership explained why they were moving away from routine antibiotic use. And they deserve some credit because they moved earlier than the other big chicken producers. But they said, this is what our customers want.
3,000 comments a month from their customers, asking them why they were still using antibiotics. And then in 2014, they announced they weren't going to, and they dragged the rest of the chicken industry along behind them.
Are there antibiotics in my milk, cheese, yogurt, and yogurt?
Some of those I don't really know. Let's talk about milk, because it comes up a fair bit. And let me back up a second and say that the vast majority of my work is focused on antibiotic-resistant bacteria in food. So when I talk about the crisis, it's about resistant bugs on the food, not residues of the drug in the food. There are, and sometimes the industry tends to conflate those two. I'm not sure why, maybe for other purposes, but I think it's because there's long been regulations in place in dairy, for example, that dictate that the dairy producer can't milk a cow within a certain period of when they're going to get antibiotics. So it's called a withdrawal time. And that's designed specifically to ensure that your milk won't have above a certain amount of antibiotic residue. So I think there could still be some antibiotics, but underneath whatever threshold the USDA has set. But again, by and large, what we're talking about is resistant bugs in food, not drugs in food.
Right. So antibiotics are used in dairy cattle in different ways than they're used in meat animals. I mean, in meat animals, they're used to put on more muscle because it's the tasty muscle that we eat, right? But in the case of dairy cattle, it's often not to produce muscle because they're not going to be sold for meat until the end of their useful lives. The antibiotics are used instead to prevent or cure infections, primarily mastitis, to keep them producing milk freely. And so that's more of a treatment effect. It's also a bigger dose than a growth-promoting dose. And as David was saying, there's very strict rules for withdrawal periods. One of the few places where until recently the FDA really cracked down on antibiotic use was an antibiotic residue. So you can actually see, if you go on the FDA's website, you can see the names of farms that they have busted for breaking the withdrawal period for dairy. And in some cases, even for like selling exhausted dairy cattle for meat, and there'll be too much drug residue in their flesh. But all of that arises because dairy as an industry, uses antibiotics differently than beef cattle do.
Are there antibiotics in our drinking water? And how did it get there, if there is?
Probably yes.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about this?
Go ahead.
So a dirty secret of antibiotics is that when we take an antibiotic, we're prescribed far more in any dose than is actually going to work in our bodies. We pee out most of it. Sewage plants aren't designed to take antibiotics out of water the way they are designed to take pathogenic bacteria out. There isn't a lot of study of this, but there's one project that's run by, I think, the US Geological Survey that tests surface waters in the United States for what they call personal care products, which is everything from various cosmetic ingredients to pharmaceutical ingredients, and antibiotics are among those. And whether the source is agriculture or our own bodies taking prescriptions or sewage waste from hospitals, not so much manufacturing because there's not a lot of antibiotic manufacturing in the US, though there is some. There is a detectable level of antibiotic washing around in our water system.
So this program you were talking about, the USGS program, it was called, I think, NACWA, standard for the National, Water Survey, something or other. Anyway, if you're ever at a doubt of, what kind of the government bureaucrats are doing that benefits you, this program was a classic example. They were doing a survey that was periodic. I don't remember if it was yearly or every couple of years. And they went out and did water samples from some 40 different watersheds. So we had an incredible series over many, many years that showed, by the way, that not only antibiotics were in your drinking water, but caffeine was one of the biggest. So if you wonder where all those Starbucks coffees are going, in your drinking water is one answer. So they were showing that these things were ending up in our drinking water supplies, and that there tended to be not only a problem, but somewhat of an upward trend. Well, apparently some folks in Congress didn't like this. So I was looking at pesticides in the same water sources in the late 90s, and this program was generating quite a bit of media attention So Congress's solution was to try to get rid of the budget for that program so that our tax-supported employees were basically being asked not to do that research anymore. And this is the problem, is that, you know, it's hard to get money to fund these things that are benefiting us by telling us what's really going on, but oftentimes when they're successful programs, there's a lot of pressure to get rid of them. We see that time and time again.
So where are antibiotic-resistant bacteria in our food? And is this really a big problem? Because I know lots of people that eat beef, chicken, pork, eggs, and I don't see or hear that most of them are in the hospital with an antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So where in our food supply would we find this, and how come I'm not seeing more people in my circle succumb to a problem from them?
Can I take that?
Yes, please do.
So this is a hard thing to wrap your hands around, but many of us are carrying around resistant bacteria in our microbiome right now. And we're healthy, right? So far as we know. But we are. And here that's a hard thing to appreciate, but just because you have a resistant bacteria in you doesn't mean you're going to get sick from it, but it also doesn't mean that you won't. You may get sick down the road from that bacteria, which, who knows, maybe that was from a piece of, you know, undercooked meat that you ate years ago. The key is your immune system. It's only when you go in the hospital for some other reason and your immune system's suppressed that suddenly you might develop a drug-resistant urinary tract infection or septicemia. Like, we just assume you got that in the hospital, but that's not necessarily the case. You could have been colonized with that resistant bug for months, years, and just never been weak enough for it to manifest. So just because we can't appreciate friends that ate something and got sick immediately doesn't mean that they're not eating something that will affect them down the road. And that makes it harder. Again, back to the question of why there's not more media attention. When things are remote in time between cause and effect, it makes it very hard to tell a good story. It doesn't mean there's no story to tell, it's just a heck of a lot harder.
There's a researcher in Washington who has gone out and studied the urinary tract infections in hospital patients and bought chicken in the same town and studied the bacteria on the chicken. And his conclusion was that possibly 10% of the urinary tract infections, the UTIs, in the United States each year are caused by bacteria traveling on food. And the way that works is that, like we talked about, the drug-resistant bacteria are on the meat when the meat leaves the slaughterhouse. You consume the meat. If you haven't cooked it to the surface of the sun, some of the bacteria have survived, or they've contaminated your cutting board or your lettuce or your knife or something like that. Maybe those bacteria don't make you sick right away. Maybe they just take up residence in your gut among all the other bacteria there. Well, maybe something throws your immune system off and causes an infection. Or maybe, the ladies here will know what I'm talking about, maybe you just happen to get a UTI the way you do. And it happens that maybe the UTI, the bacteria you pushed in the wrong direction, happens to be one of those resistant bacteria, which means that you get a bladder infection that's a resistant bladder infection. And when you go to your doctor and they give you the antibiotics that they always write first thing without even doing a test, those antibiotics don't work because the bacteria is already resistant. So you take the pills, and then you feel the symptoms again. And you think, oh, I just got reinfected, it came back. But it was always there. It didn't respond to the antibiotics because the antibiotics never worked. And there are people every year, thousands of people every year, who, because of those resistant urinary tract infections that can't be treated by antibiotics, that climb up the system to the bladder and up to the kidneys and into the bloodstream, end up with septic shock as a result of bacteria that came to them on a piece of meat they ate. And now I just gave a shout out to women because we're the ones that are the most common victims of UTIs. This isn't only a problem for women. In fact, one of the biggest sets of data about drug-resistant urinary tract infections has been done at the VA, where most of the patients are men, because men, when they get older, are more vulnerable to urinary tract infections, and this same phenomenon appears in them as well.
And just to check in those numbers, so 10% maybe of those UTIs every year. How many UTIs in a year? About 6 million. So 10% would be 600,000 resistant UTIs perhaps that are coming from the food supply. That's a lot of infections.
So why don't we just develop more antibiotics?
Because it takes 10 to 15 years and $1 billion to make one.
That's a good reason.
So think about this as though you were a pharmaceutical company. It takes 10 years and $1 billion to make a new drug. Those are pretty, that's not only for antibiotics, it's pretty standard industry numbers. That's a lot of R&D that you're going to have to earn back. Let's say you have a fantastic new antibiotic and you put it out there and hospitals buy it and doctors start giving it to patients. And bacteria, as they do, begin reacting to your drug and defending themselves and become resistant. Let's say that in 5 years, 20% of a particular kind of bacteria that your drug might be prescribed for, let's say staph, are resistant. 20% is a tipping point. 20% is the point at which a doctor might say, maybe I don't want to prescribe that drug anymore. Maybe my patient will be the unlucky one of the 5 for whom it doesn't work. If you're the drug company, your sales just fell off a cliff, and you probably haven't made that R&D budget of $1 billion back. Or maybe if your drug is really amazing, the kind of antibiotic that no one's seen in 50 years, maybe medicine looks at your drug when your pharmaceutical salespeople come to the hospital and says, yeah, that is fantastic. We're really going to need that. We are going to buy it and put it on the back of the cabinet against the day when we need a last resort drug. So either you have sales and they run out too fast, or you have sales that are never big enough because no one's using your drug. Either way, you don't make back your investment, which makes your shareholders very unhappy. What makes your shareholders happy is making drugs that people need to buy all the time. And that's things like insulin, statins, cancer drugs, Viagra, things that people will take every day for the rest of their lives. That's a regular source of income, and antibiotics are not.
So I don't know, I'm just going to throw this out here and see what you all think. When I think about antibiotics and our desire to keep them as effective for as long as possible, I actually think that antibiotics are a public good. They're a lot more like the police and the fire department than they are like Viagra. Because, I mean, you really need police and fire. And but you don't really need Viagra. And you really need an antibiotic to work when you really need it. The other thing that makes them a public good from an economist standpoint is that a public good is something where the more you use it, the more any one of us uses it, the more it diminishes that public good for the rest of us. So the classic example was the New England town green, where it used to be available for everybody to graze on for free. But if one person monopolized it and they overgrazed it, then nobody else in the little town in New England could use the town green. And antibiotics are a lot like that. The more any one of us overuse them, the less effective they're going to be down the road for the rest of us. So is that really something that works well to ask private for-profit companies to first develop and then to sell as much of it as possible. Doesn't work. It hasn't worked, and that's part, I think, of why we're in here. I don't have the magic solution, but I suspect that the solution is not a law that's going to funnel billions and billions of dollars to pharmaceutical companies. I don't think that might work in the short term, but as Maryn said, even if we are able to come up with a really unique new drug, resistance to it is going to develop very quickly.
I like the idea of thinking of antibiotics like firemen.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all pay taxes every year, right? And one of the things that our taxes go to is supporting the fire department. We pay for the fire department even if our house never burns down. In fact, we kind of want our house not to ever burn down, but we're still paying for the firemen in case we ever need them. And maybe we should pay for antibiotics the same way, in case we ever need them, hoping that we never will.
Is the issue of antibiotic-resistant bacteria being addressed by the USDA or FDA or EPA or CDC or some other part of the United States government?
Well.
So many ways to answer.
So since we were talking about antibiotic resistance in the food system, it is fair to say that we have had some positive change in the past couple of years. In the last days of the Obama administration, literally one of the last things they did as they went out the door was they made those doses of antibiotics that make animals get fat faster functionally illegal in the United States. That doesn't solve the whole problem because they didn't address the issue of using antibiotics to prevent disease in animals. There are very few societies on the planet who have, and we're probably not going to do that under the current administration because they're a pretty pro-business administration. But you can see in the federal data that just over the past 2 years, that sales of antibiotics for use in livestock are starting to trend down. So in that sense, it's good.
Yeah, I'll give you the flip side of it, though. It's true that in January of 2017, I'm sorry, my bad. In January of 2017, the FDA finally followed through and did something that it had been talking about for almost 50 years, maybe
40.
longer.
Yeah.
And about 20 years after it was done in Denmark, for example. So that is a step in the right direction. And there has been a drop in overall antibiotic sales for use in livestock since then. It's gone down about, I forget the number, 28%, something like that. But we started from a very, very high level. So in our pig production, for example, our pig farmers still use about 7 times more antibiotics per pound of pig produced as they do in Denmark, which is like the largest pig exporter in the world, or largest pork exporter. So we started from a much higher level, and we decreased the amount less than they did in Denmark, which started from a lower level. And the result is that our usage is still exceedingly high relative to a low user like Denmark, or the Netherlands, or the United Kingdom now. So we've got a long way to go. So I would say, yes, a good step is better than no step at all, but there is a time dimension here, and the crisis is getting worse, and at the glacial pace we've gone thus far, we're going to be in trouble more likely than not. So we need to pick up the pace and do more. One of the things that the USDA and FDA have refused to do is to set a simple target, something like this. I, the commissioner of the FDA, vow that we will cut the use of human antibiotics in livestock production by 50% relative to where it was in 2009, for example. Well, from every place in the world that's tried to do that, that's a very achievable goal. Sounds like a lot, right? But they've decreased it already by 64% in the Netherlands, by probably about the same in Denmark. The UK is well on its way. We could do 50%. But those public agencies have refused to set a target like that because it's controversial and they're going to get pressure not to. But I think, as an advocate, it's hard to reach a goal if you don't set a goal in the first place.
Maryn, you wrote 3 books, Beating Back the Devil, Superbug, The Fatal Menace of MRSA, MRSA, and then Big Chicken, The Incredible Story of How Antibiotics Created Modern Agriculture and Changed the Way the World Eats. Could you just give us, I guess, the main point that you would say to summarize what the main point of each book, of what was the main conclusion that you came to from each of those books?
Sure, thank you. So my first book, Beating Back the Devil, is the story of the disease detectives of the CDC, who are called the Epidemic Intelligence Service. They're a very little known sort of SWAT team for infections that have existed since the Korean War, and I spent a year embedded with them, and then the book is the story of that year and the story of the previous 50 years. And the lesson of that book is that there will always be some new disease threat, and we have to be prepared for it. We don't know what it's going to be. Every time that a new disease threat arrives, it takes us by surprise. So what we need is to be sure that we keep strong the structures of surveillance, of lab work, of field investigators, all of that funded by the government, that allows us to counter a disease when it arises in this country or crosses our borders. Superbug is the story of how antibiotic resistance rose around the world. It's essentially the biography of MRSA, drug-resistant staph, from the very first cases in 1961 right up to the present day. MRSA, drug-resistant staph, began as a hospital problem. Antibiotics at the time were mostly given in hospitals. And in about the 1990s, it kind of leaked out from hospitals into the rest of the world. And that's why now we see so many pro athletes, for instance, having MRSA infections, and kids getting MRSA pneumonia and dying very rapidly. They're not getting those infections because they've been in hospitals. They just picked it up in their everyday lives. And the lesson of Superbug is kind of a lesson of unintended consequences, that we just didn't look far enough ahead. When we started using antibiotics in that first enthusiasm at the beginning of the antibiotic era, that we thought they would protect us because we thought there would always be another drug. And we never thought through the economic implications of using drugs so enthusiastically, antibiotics so enthusiastically. And Big Chicken, as I've been telling you, is the story of it's a story that I stumbled across when I was researching Superbug and talking to physicians and researchers and people who'd had drug-resistant infections and families of kids who didn't survive. They all said to me, antibiotics are precious. Antibiotics are a limited natural resource, and we have to protect them and conserve their power. And in the midst of it, of hearing that, I stumbled across a set of numbers that David knows very well, which is that in a particular year, not long ago, in 2011, we used 4 times as many antibiotics in animals in the United States as we did in human beings. And having just heard that from all these people involved in the fight against drug-resistant infections, that antibiotics were so precious, I could not make sense of how we were using them so freely in animals. And I went on a journey to discover how we had come to do that. And Big Chicken is the story of how we didn't take antibiotics seriously and gave them to most of the meat animals on the planet and created the modern meat production system that we have, and how now, just on the edge of disaster, maybe we are finally turning the ship around, although I'm not clear whether we really have done it in enough time to save ourselves. We'll see. Thank you for asking.
David, you work at the National Resource Defense Council, and they cover a lot of important topics. If you had to summarize everything you've learned, the most important pieces of information and concerns you have that you wanted to pass on to everyone else, how would you answer that?
I would say at NRDC, everywhere I've worked really, I would say people don't understand how powerful even an individual voice is. Like many of the people in Congress or at the FDA who are making these decisions, if they get a phone call or, God forbid, a letter, an actual letter, maybe not an email, they pay attention. If they get 100 phone calls, they really pay attention. So the value of an NRDC or a similar group is that it brings people together to speak with a common voice, and that's hugely important. That's the only way any of this is going to change in the time frame that we have, is for people to act together and to kind of all climb on board. And it doesn't matter if it's this issue or many of the other important issues that we work on and that are kind of out in your communities on a day-to-day basis.
So what can we do to stop a future where antibiotics don't work? If we had a government that was willing to listen and willing to spend the money and we had full cooperation, what would be the exact steps that you would take if you were in charge and everyone would listen to prevent a future where antibiotics don't work?
You want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. So I'll take this from my side. So the first thing we can do is not overuse antibiotics, because the faster we overuse them, the more chances we give for bacteria to adapt. So on the medical side, that means that we shouldn't bug our doctors to give us antibiotics when we don't need them, when we have colds, when we have things that antibiotics won't take care of. It really does make a difference. If you have a cold, for instance, which is a viral infection, and you take antibiotics, you're not affecting the cold, but you may be affecting other bacteria in your body in a way that turns some of them toward resistance, and that may later make you sick, as we talked about, or may migrate to someone else that you love. Possibly a third of the antibiotic prescriptions written in the United States every year are written inappropriately. They're written for conditions that antibiotics can't affect. And I have talked to doctor after doctor after doctor who has said, I really don't like to write prescriptions, but my patients come in and they bug me for it. And if I don't give them the prescription, they go away and they write a bad Yelp review. With so many urgent care centers and retail medicine, doctors really go in fear of Yelp reviews right now. So the first thing is we can commit to not using antibiotics badly. The second is that we can support people who are trying to make a difference in not using antibiotics badly. And in the food realm, that means when you go to the supermarket, look for a package of meat that says no antibiotics ever, or raised without antibiotics. It used to be really hard to find that. You could only find it at Whole Foods or a small health food store or eating at someplace like Chipotle. Now every single chicken company working in the United States has committed to some degree of antibiotic control. And every single one of those companies has or is creating a label within their portfolios of brands that is no antibiotics ever. So buy it if you see it, because getting the infusion of dollars tells them that they're on the right track. And if you don't see it, march up to the consumer service desk of your supermarket and ask why they're not selling antibiotic-free meat.
So building on that second theme, NRDC's been working with several other partner groups for 4 years now, and every September we've put out a report card on the top 25 or so retail companies, retail food companies. So from McDonald's and Starbucks all the way through to Domino's, Wendy's, Sonic Cafe, Chick-fil-A, just the whole shebang. And we've surveyed them about what their position, their policy is around antibiotics. And then we graded them. When we started, it was a struggle to get them to return the survey. Well, they're returning the survey now, and in fact, there's been a pretty dramatic shift. The first couple of years, we mainly focused on chicken, and the chicken industry has, as we said, done a pretty remarkable turnaround. About half of it now, by our estimates, is using antibiotics sparingly or not at all, human antibiotics. And that's a big shift. And now the trick is to get the beef and the pork industries to follow suit. So if you go to antibioticsoffthemenu.org, that's the campaign website that these groups have created together, and we're vowing to continue to hold the biggest companies in the country accountable for the use of antibiotics in the products that they serve at their restaurants. All right? And that's what I was saying earlier about the power of people acting collectively. That's kind of where you and I meet, is bringing that together and calling out both the good actors and the bad actors. It's not just chicken, though. After one of the survey recipients for many years, of course, has been McDonald's, biggest beef purchaser in the world, one company. If you think about their global supply chain, it's enormous. And to its credit, regardless of what you think about their menu or their products, they put out an antibiotics policy that's actually pretty okay, even good. And they are making some promises to reduce routine antibiotic use in their beef production, or the companies that they buy beef from. Now, do we know if they're going to follow through? No, we don't. So we're going to be looking, and all of us need to be looking to make sure they follow through in that commitment. And that's another important thing for the public at large to help us do.
Maryn, your book, Big Chicken, says, Big Chicken, the incredible story of how antibiotics created modern agriculture and changed the way the world eats. You have a comment from Mark Bittman that says, a must-read for anyone who cares about the quality of food and the welfare of animals. You have the back, someone says, Big Chicken is a fascinating story of big food and the price we pay for cheap food. Maryn Nestle, who's a well-known author, says, if you think raising farm animals on antibiotics is nothing to worry about, Big Chicken will change your mind in a hurry. Maryn McKenna's account of the profit-driven politics that allowed widespread antibiotic resistance should be required reading for anyone who cares about food and health. Martin Blasser, an author of Missing Microbes, said, a modern Upton Sinclair, Maryn McKenna explains how our food is actually produced today. Big Chicken is highly readable, shocking, open your eyes to the risks we've been incurring, a most important book. Jeremy Farrar says, drug-resistant infections are among the greatest challenges of our time. Maryn McKenna makes this challenge personal and compelling, illustrating how antibiotic resistance has been developing and why we should care and what we should all demand to address it. And finally, Laurie Garrett, who's written about antibiotic resistance, says you will never look at chicken nuggets the same way after you read Maryn McKenna's meticulously researched, riveting book, and you shouldn't. Bravo, McKenna, for a tour de force of environmental science and food writing. So the question is, do you eat chicken?
I do, actually. I do. So one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book is that I am a meat eater. I am not embarrassed to say that. And I think that it ought to be possible for someone who eats meat to be able to interrogate how we raise meat and to ask that that production be better. I have huge respect for friends who are vegan. I have some friends who are prominent vegan activists. But I don't think the world is going to go vegan. I think that meat consumption is hardwired into us. In just one example of that, one of the signals that economists rely on to tell whether a national economy is improving is whether meat sales go up. Because as soon as people get a little bit of extra income, as soon as they enter the middle class, they start to buy meat instead of just buying lentils and pulses. So I wanted to know, was it possible that I wanted to know how badly our food system had gone off the rails, And I view antibiotic use as sort of the foundational, kind of the original sin of modern meat production, because without antibiotics, the rest of the system collapses. The first scene of the book is me eating chicken in a street market in Paris, where in France, chickens are raised in a very different manner. They're raised in the way that our grandparents or great-grandparents would have raised them. And they're delicious and they're safe because they don't get antibiotics. But I end the book in Brooklyn eating a bird that came from a small farm in upstate New York that was as delicious as the bird from France, that also had been raised antibiotic-free. And my point in transposing those two is that one of the things that the routine use of antibiotics did in creating our modern meat system is to create a system that competes solely on price. It drove the cost of production down so far, it made production so cheap. There's one of the chicken breeders of the 1950s said to the House of Representatives that there couldn't be anything wrong with a system that made meat as cheap as the price of bread. Small producers that don't use antibiotics, producers that espouse high animal welfare, producers that are essentially family farms, could never compete on price. But when we take antibiotics out of the equation and have to improve animals' lives as a result, then we're asking producers to compete not just on price, but on quality and on ethics. It opens up the market again, I believe, for ethical meat production. And that, to me, is one of the greatest benefits of going antibiotic-free, is it opens up the market to producers of all sizes, especially smaller producers whom the rush to inexpensive production had squeezed out.
So now you know why more people don't write about this topic. It's because she does such a good job. Like they're sort of afraid to step into that territory, I think.
David, based on what you know about antibiotic-resistant bacteria, do you eat animal products still?
Do I? I do. I try to, less and less. I have a daughter who, for medical reasons, will always be like a super vegan. But the rest of us eat meat, maybe less than we did, although the less meat is less about antibiotics and more about my increasing unease about the climate impacting practices that a lot of meat production entails. And so I think there are reasons for us to reduce our meat consumption in a lot of cases. Americans on the whole are just so far beyond the pale in terms of how much meat we eat that we could reduce that overall consumption by quite a bit and still be above the world average by far. So, and I don't exclude myself from that group. But I try to get to know the farmers who are raising that meat. We're lucky in St. Paul that everything sold in the St. Paul farmers market has to be from within 50 miles. So you really can be driving down a road and see the farm that you saw at the farmers market and have some ground truthing that what they say is going on is actually going on. And a lot of them from my work I've gotten to know too. So I think more and more people in the US with the farmers markets growing in number have been able to have that experience with the people that raise their food, and that's a good thing.
I'd like to open it up to questions from anyone. Please raise your hand and we'll give you a mic. Why don't you guys call on whoever you like, whoever you want.
Are we driving this?
Yeah.
How about the gentleman in the front? Are you bringing up a mic for him? Okay.
Yes, please wait for the mic. And also, please, I would like to ask everyone a favor before you ask your question. When we open it up, we want to have as many people have a chance, and we want to hear from the speakers. So I would strongly prefer if everyone would try to say everything they have to say in 30 seconds with just one question and not tell a personal story. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for coming and presenting this wonderful information you're presenting.
Well, it's not on, I'm sorry. Okay. Do we have another mic to give?
Do you have?
This better?
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
okay. I just want to thank you for coming and presenting this information that you're presenting, and obviously you both are scholars and you've done extensive work in your fields, and I certainly agree with a lot of what you have to say, and I've done some research myself, so I want to thank you for that. And I just wanted to know, knowing that the extensive research you've done in your areas about antibiotics, there's certainly other aspects of meat that's related to health as well. And knowing that you both are meat eaters, are you open to learning more about the effects of meat on your bodies as well as on the animals and people in general?
Sure. I mean, I think that diet is, finding your optimal diet is a lifelong process, right? And just as you receive more knowledge over time, you receive more knowledge about, or sort of experience about what works and doesn't work for your personal metabolism. So yeah, certainly. Thank you for your question. They're behind you.
Hi, thank you. A minute ago, you just talked about the factory farms that are not using antibiotics, but they still can't compete with the small family farm. And I think my question is, how do we get people to distinguish between chicken that is still being raised in a factory farm situation? They might not be using antibiotics, but it's still not going to be able to compete price-wise with the small family farmer that's really trying to do it the right way. And then I also had a question about an article today in the New York Times in the science section about gut health and bacteria, and it was a really great article. And they're talking about gut health and the microbiome actually affecting your brain as well for Alzheimer's, autism, dementia. And I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about that, so it wouldn't be really bacteria resistant as much as our antibiotics killing our good bacteria that are maybe causing some of the brain problems that we're having.
I can't address the microbiome part. Can you?
Yeah, I don't feel like I'm an expert in that. There's, the list of people that gave blurbs for Maryn's book include a lot of folks in New York City that are really expert. Like Marty Blazer is at NYU. He's actually got a microbiome center, and those are popping up all over the country. So I would direct you to some of the websites. Now, what's true, and what I think you're getting at, is that a lot of the microbiome research isn't really looking directly at diet per se and how diet choices affect the microbiome. They're kind of still in the discovery of like, what is the microbiome and how does it impact health? But unfortunately, they're sort of repeating a pattern of not doing enough research on diet and its impact on health. And that's been a long-standing problem, in part because like the NIH, which funds a lot of the medical research, has not been fond of funding whole diet studies. And so it's been tough for even the biggest, the researchers with the best reputations to get steady funding for those whole diet studies, which is a shame. But it's one reason why we're left kind of to pontificate about how the microbiome is impacted by X, Y, or Z, rather than actually having data driving our conclusions. We're just not there yet. Remind me of the first part of your question, because I wanted to answer that. Oh, right. 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 So, do you mind?
No, go ahead.
So one of the challenges for all of us is how many of us actually farm? Like very few, right? Less than 1%. Most of us have no idea what's going on farms. All we have to guide our decision making at the grocery store is what we read, and probably more often what's on a label. And so over the last several years, there's been a real trend, a profusion of labels So it can be tough to wade through what those labels actually say and what they mean. So Consumer Reports has a green labels program that actually wades through all the labels. I recommend that site to you. There are animal welfare labels, like animal welfare approved, for example, and there's
Certified
another
humane.
certified humane. That's the one I was looking for. Right. Yeah, they're not by labels, I mean a label that carries an audit program where certifiers go out and inspect the farm to make sure that what the label says is actually real world conditions on the farm. And the challenge, if you're a small farmer, is who pays for that? And unfortunately, we're still in a position where farmers are having to pay to be able to tell the story of what they're doing to the consumer public. And you're right, it puts them at a competitive disadvantage, especially when they face so many other challenges relative to a really huge producer that tends to produce more conventionally, i.e. with more antibiotics, for example.
Okay. Go ahead.
My question is, I don't know if it's the right question for you, but anyway, the connection between GMOs, the impact on anti-resistant bacteria, because the animals are eating GMO, which creates pesticide factories in the gut and leaky gut syndrome. I'm sure there's a connection, but is there anything that you can say about that?
GMO is a topic that I really stay away from because it's so complicated. Do you have anything to say about this?
I don't. I think all these things are systems, right? So I'm sure there are connections. I'm just not knowledgeable enough about what they are. And I suspect that our society doesn't know the full story yet. So I hate to speculate, but I think one of the real appeals behind like an organic model or other models of farming sustainably is that you can kind of get away from having to prove all those connections and just do something that makes sense from a holistic sustainability standpoint. So, organic, one of the, for example, precepts of an organic model is that you don't bring inputs into your operation, or you try not to, from outside the farm. You try to use as much as you can within the farm. And one of the things that does is that it gives you more awareness of what actually is being used, but it also gives you some reassurance that if there is a problem, it's something you can deal with. It's not somebody else's responsibility. So a lot of these things like antibiotics and GMOs, to me, they fall under kind of that bucket. When you bring stuff in from outside that has its own supply chain, as a farmer, it's just a lot harder for you to have control over what you're doing.
Thank you.
Hello. There is a solution for the problem. There is clean meat, which is completely antibiotic free. It's free of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, vaccines, and it doesn't cost the earth. It should hit the market shelves this year. Just Inc. Have you heard about it? Josh Tedrick?
So when you say clean meat, do you mean plant-based meat or do you mean lab-grown meat?
No, it's meat that's brewed like beer.
Right.
Lab meat, cellular agriculture.
It's cellular agriculture, but it has so many advantages, and it actually tastes really good.
So, can I take this?
Yeah, please.
I'm a skeptic of technological optimism. I have spoken to a number of the clean meat experimenters. But by clean meat, what we're talking about here is animal cells that are grown in a dish, basically, right? Animal cells grown outside an animal. And I've tasted some of the prototypes. They're delicious, or at least interesting, and have been produced in very small quantities. Where I think the real danger is I don't see any evidence yet that lab-grown meat can scale without the use of antibiotics. Once you start growing something in giant reactors, your chance of contamination and of the need to keep down inappropriate organisms becomes orders of magnitude more difficult than when you're talking about a reactor the size of a shoebox. So I think the case is not proven. And for myself, I'm going to have to see a lot more evidence that clean meat can do things at the scale that it says that it can for it to actually be a solution. But I also have a couple more, not so much objections as questions to raise. The first is, though, as David said, a relatively small proportion of our society farms relative to those who farmed 100 years ago, we still have a lot of people producing animal protein. What are you going to do with those people if we're going to grow protein in a dish? We need to do, the clean meat solution has to be in part, what do you do with the farming economy that we have? And my biggest, and again, this is my concern for the unfilled promises of technological optimism, is that though at the moment the genetics of chicken and turkey are owned by a couple of multinationals, pork and beef and lamb and duck are all open source foods, right? They're not closed, dead-end foods like GMO seeds, where you can't breed one seed from a next and you have to go back to the company for each crop. You have to do that for chickens, but pigs and cattle reproduce naturally. Lab-grown meat is intellectual property. It's going to belong to very large companies. It's going to belong to tech companies. I am not convinced, especially given the events of the past couple of years, that tech companies are necessarily the best guardians of the public good. Making food become intellectual property, that is a trend that I would like to see less of, not more of. And I am concerned, thank you, that lab meat can take us in the direction of food being more intellectual property rather than less. That is probably a minority view.
What she said.
Thank you.
No, I mean, you're in New York. I assume most of you are in New York. There's still a lot of small-scale production up north of here. I know that. But in a state like Minnesota, which is a largish state, you go 3 hours west of the Twin Cities, and boy, those communities are suffering. And they've been suffering for a really, really long time because the marketplace, most of them were mostly corn and soybeans, but they don't actually make money on corn and soybeans without government payment programs and insurance programs. The marketplace does not give them a price that keeps them on their land and in their home. So meat was always the thing that they could do on the side that would actually make money, and it tended to be counter-cyclical. So I don't know if that's still true, but that means that when the markets for the row crops were bad, the meat prices tended to be up. So the fact that now the biggest market for pork, for example, is shut down, or was shut down, and we export 1/3 of our pork. I have other issues with that. I don't think that's such a good thing. But the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of families who raise pork who are really hurting. And I agree that it's only going to increase the strife and the level of angst in rural America to have that continue to be a situation.
Shall we go to this side? And then we'll come back over here.
My glasses, hold on. There's something that you said that really caught my interest in terms of our focus over here with the 5G next generation technology with the EMF pollution. Because one of the outcomes, if this is released, is that there's going to be many more skin diseases because of the small millimeter wavelength. And you said that there was going to be an issue if there's interruptions in the protection of the skin. And could you explain what that is? That there's a gateway of some kind, and I'm very concerned about the connection between what you're saying and what we know is going to happen. There's going to be more skin infection.
Do you know which of us that was?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics, but I mean, the skin is the largest immune organ in the body, right? So it's not only a physical barrier, but it's like the first line of immune defense. So all of us are constantly nicking our skin. Now, fortunately, it's pretty resilient, but yeah, it's always been a potential portal for infection. And with a general increase in resistant bacteria, I suppose that that makes those bacteria more of a threat, I guess, through skin entrance. But there's lots of ways they can enter the body. They can enter when you scratch your nose. They can enter when you rub your eye. They can enter through what you eat, and then they can enter via your skin as well.
Let's go to this side, I think.
I just have a question about, well, it's a two-part question. One is, I have chickens myself, and I know that they are very hard to keep clean. So are you concerned at all about the mass production in the chicken without the antibiotics and the infection? And how do you feel about essential oils for managing infection? And then when it comes to superbugs, isn't it important that we maintain optimal health for keeping them at bay, or how do you feel about that?
So David mentioned Purdue Chicken. Purdue is the fourth largest chicken company in the United States, based in Salisbury, Maryland, out in that part of the East Coast where Maryland and Delaware and Virginia all come together, the Delmarva Peninsula. And they're a family-owned company, which makes them a little more nimble. They don't have the pressure of Wall Street breathing down their necks. In 2014, Purdue, the chairman, Jim Purdue, do people remember the Frank Purdue commercials? Remember, yeah, you just now have confessed how old you all are, but I remember them too, so we'll all be old together. So the current chairman is the son of Frank Purdue. It takes a tough man to make a tender chicken, and the grandson of the founder. And in 2014, he called a press conference and he announced that they were taking their entire company antibiotic-free. In fact, that they had been quietly doing research for a decade to prove that they could do this. And they now, so that was 5 years ago, and they have in fact accomplished this. As they moved through going antibiotic-free, they discovered some really interesting things, which was that in order to sustain the birds' immune systems in the absence of antibiotics, they had to go back to kind of older farm practices. Now, they're still raising millions of chickens a week in barns that hold 30,000 chickens at a time. But they changed the birds' diets. They made their diets a lot more pure. They gave them more vaccines. They gave them things to exercise on. They cut windows in the barns so the birds could get sunlight on their feathers, which may induce some vitamin production, but certainly makes them feel better. And they added to their diets a number of sort of natural antiseptics, among which are yucca and cinnamon and oregano oil and thyme oil. In fact, antibiotic-free producers are now buying so much oregano and thyme that I'm kind of waiting for a counterfeit market to start. Because the natural oils in those herbs are sort of natural sterilizers. And it's worked brilliantly. I mean, you go into a chicken house now. I have been in a number of these chicken houses, as the barns are called, and it smells like a pizzeria because they're using so many herbs. I don't know anything about purified essential oils, but there's and anything outside of those particular herbs, but there definitely is a botanical component to what the big chicken producers are doing now. I don't know anything about essential oils otherwise, though. Over here?
Thank you for the information. All right, I have a question. You know, over the years, I've read many books about the fact that we are in great danger because many of these bugs are becoming antibiotic resistant. So I want to ask you about a few natural alternatives. One you mentioned is oil of oregano, colloidal silver, manuka honey, propolis, and usnea. I've read that usnea is very good for strep. So I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So rather than address the individual botanicals, let me say this. Since this is an audience interested in natural products, you probably know this already much better than I do. But the regulation and standard setting of botanical products in the United States is nowhere near as good as it is, for instance, in Europe, in Germany in particular. That means that one of the problems that creates is that there aren't good products to do reliable scientific testing on. And also, because these products are sold under a supplement scheme and not under a pharmaceutical scheme, they don't make anywhere near as much money for companies, and therefore it's not productive to do scientific testing on them. Therefore, there have been relatively few trials putting natural products, natural antiseptics, up against antibiotics. Where there have been trials, which is largely outside the United States, for things like thymol, the active ingredient in thyme oil, essentially, and the active ingredient in manuka honey, what they show is that you can misuse those in the same way that you can misuse antibiotics, that they are, in the end, a chemical compound. And bacteria will adapt to them and learn to defend themselves against them in the same way that they will learn to defend themselves against an antibiotic. So, so I think I'll just stop there. Did you have anything to say about that?
No, that about captures my inability to directly answer the specifics too.
On this side?
I would say that, I've had a lot of interactions with medical colleagues who have gotten functional medicine training and integrative medicine training, and it took allopathic medicine is what we typically refer to as physicians in the U.S. There are other traditions, osteopathy, homeopathy, naturopathy. Allopaths have been very late to the game to learning about things like botanicals, to learning about nutrition, but they are the ones within the medical community who have been working to try to integrate that knowledge base with what you read in the New England Journal of Medicine. I think we're very early in that process, but it's really exciting. And, for those who want to get that kind of a question answered, I think the integrative medicine community in general is very good at that. And there's probably a lot of those folks here.
Was there someone on this side?
Yeah, hi.
Oh, there you are.
I'm here. I've read some studies, but not really much.
Lift the microphone.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Does wireless radiation create more antibiotic-resistant bacteria? I thought I had seen some studies on that, and I don't know how well-founded those are. Can you comment?
I've never heard that.
I have never heard that. I would have to see a study.
And I left it printed in my printer at home, so I'm very sorry, because I made copies for you. But maybe I'll email it. Are drug-resistant bacteria also more aggressive bacteria?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that is a good question. The answer is sometimes.
Okay.
Right.
But, I mean, sometimes they are also more virulent. But that is kind of context dependent.
Right.
I mean, so you may have a bacterium that is resistant to multiple antibiotics, but is not necessarily more virulent, causing more severe disease than one that is not resistant. We get in it's kind of a trap of thinking that like drug-resistant infections are the really big bad, but in the case of resistant staph and plain garden staph, sort of sensitive staph is also a really dangerous infection, and we tend to forget that because we think drug resistance is the worst. At least, having written a book about staph, I think that, and I'm wrong.
And if I could just squeeze this in, I thought that exposing myself a little bit to germs and not being so germ-phobic would help my immune system. And based upon what you were saying about the bacteria hanging out in your body for months and years and then coming out later, maybe that's not such a good idea for me to want to expose myself
Can
a
I
little
talk
bit
about the
more
hygiene
to create my
hypothesis?
immunity.
Yeah. Okay, so David a few minutes ago mentioned Martin Blazer, who is a professor and the head of the Microbiome Center at NYU's medical school, what's now called the Langone Medical School. He wrote an amazing book called Missing Microbes, which I really recommend reading. It's a very sort of mass audience friendly book, even though it was written by a highly degreed researcher. In that book, he explores what's usually called the hygiene hypothesis, which is a contention that our lives have gotten too clean, and that because we are so obsessed with cleanliness and getting rid of bacteria and wiping our kids down and not letting them roll around in the dirt, that we have accidentally induced an epidemic of allergy and autoimmune diseases. And what's behind that is the sense, supported by a bunch of mostly observational studies, so not experiments, but watching people living their daily lives, that if children are exposed early in their lives, when their immune systems are still developing and figuring out the world, to the kind of microbes that we routinely encountered as we were evolving, they will have more robust immune systems that are better balanced. And the evidence for this is things like younger children in a family have fewer allergies than older children because the older children are bringing infections home from daycare. Kids who grow up with pets have fewer allergies than kids that grow up without pets. Kids that grow up on farms have fewer allergies than kids that live in the city. All of those are, what lies behind all of those is sort of this sense of the immune system coming to terms with insults in the environment and learning how to live in peace with them. But the key thing about that is that all of that, for that to work, all of that exposure happens pretty early in life. So you're probably not going to affect your immune response to something one way or another by letting yourself get more or less dirty or more or less covered in germs. Allowing for the fact that there are different flora in different parts of the world, and that you may become habituated to the local flora here and then travel somewhere else and suddenly find you're having a sneezing fit because you're not accustomed to what you're breathing or encountering there.
So in other words, only your kids get to claim the 5-second rule, but you can't.
I've sort of lost track. Wait, who has the microphone? Anyone? So just hand them to people with the gentleman in the tie-dye here and the woman in the orange. And then we'll send one over that way.
Hi. I just had a question regarding MRSA. I know it used to be considered hospital-acquired, and now it's jumped to being community-acquired. And my question was, I never quite understood that, how all of a sudden it wasn't hospital-acquired anymore. And I understand how you explained how it manifested itself based on possibly being more immunosuppressed in the hospital. I understand all that, but how did it end up going to be a community-acquired where you say, like, for example, a football player can get it, or I just don't understand that.
I
how
wrote a
it
book about
jumped.
this.
Really?
So it's a pretty complicated story, but the key thing to keep in mind is that staph, the S in MRSA, is a bacterium that loves to live on our skin, right? So we can carry it with us very easily, usually without knowing it, and we can carry it with us in and out of hospitals. When the researchers who first identified community staph got their hands on the earliest strains that were identified, this is in the mid-90s in Chicago, and analyzed them, they discovered that there had been a couple of key genetic changes between the strains that were flourishing in hospitals and the strains that were now coming into emergency rooms on kids from the community. It's important that it was in emergency rooms because if someone's in an emergency room, they didn't come from somewhere else in the hospital. They came from the outside world. And those genetic changes the bug had shed some of the resistances that it had because it was no longer being exposed to some of the antibiotics that would be routinely used in the hospital. But what it had gained the ability to live in the more sort of like rough and tumble outer world of sort of the everyday world where things aren't super clean. Aside from that, I recommend my book, Superbug. I'm sorry.
Well,
Publishers always say at some point you have to say, as I say in my book.
But I think I would like to add in, and actually I hope I don't put you on the spot, but there's an interesting sideline example, and that is livestock-associated MRSA in the Netherlands. So, and you've written about this, so do you mind telling that story? It's in Big Chicken.
Right, so there's hospital-acquired MRSA, there's community-acquired MRSA. When medicine says community, they mean anywhere outside a hospital. Amazing, we should speak, okay. Uh-huh.
So even though I understand it, I just figured that maybe I'd get another answer that I'd understand it a little more, because I still don't quite get it, but now I understand a little more. But
evolution is smarter than we are is the short version. So what David was referring to is that there's a third strain of MRSA, which was identified first in the Netherlands, but now has moved around the world, that actually surfaced in pigs first. Pigs and humans have very similar respiratory systems. And the pigs were being given tetracycline as a preventive and growth promoter, and it caused the MRSA in their systems to become tetracycline resistant, and then it crossed into humans and caused a massive outbreak in healthcare in the Netherlands.
So you'd appreciate this. I don't know if this is still true, but several years ago, it was the case that if you entered the hospital for whatever reason in the Netherlands, and they were doing an intake interview, and they realized that you were either a farmer or had some exposure to a farm, they put you right into isolation until they could show with cultures that you were not MRSA positive.
Thank you for your question. Go ahead.
I don't know if I'm saying it properly, but how does somebody deal with antibiotics after a really bad reaction from antibiotics? Allergic reactions.
Say it again, I didn't understand.
If you got an allergic reaction from antibiotics, how do you take new ones, like without worrying about getting that similar type of reaction?
Well, allergies are usually specific to particular proteins, so they're antibiotic specific. Now there's some exceptions, like There's often cross-reactivity in an allergic sense between penicillins and cephalosporins, for example, amoxicillin and cephalosporins. So, but in other cases, just because you had a bad reaction to one antibiotic doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have that same reaction to different antibiotics. You kind of have to have specialized testing to evaluate that, which from your standpoint would be important because you really do want to know which antibiotic you can take safely, and you don't want to be in the situation of being really sick and trying to answer that question. It's much better to answer it now while you're healthy.
So antibiotics are, pharmacologists talk about antibiotics as existing in families. And what defines an antibiotic family is there's something in the core molecule of the compound that's the same. So penicillin, amoxicillin, methicillin, all the illins have a particular arrangement of atoms at their core. Aminoglycosides have a different one, macrolides have a different one. So it might be that if you were allergic to penicillin, pulling something out of the air here, you might also be allergic to all the other psyllins, but you might be able to take vancomycin because it's in a different family and it's got a different, and the cephalosporins have that same molecule as the penicillins do.
I think 2 families have got me so far, so.
Sorry.
No, that's what
Good
I was
luck.
asking.
Is there someone on this side? Is it? No one on this side? You don't have a microphone though, do you? Now he does, okay.
Hi. Well, I just want to add to something that you said a few minutes ago. Okay. Basically is that kids, as soon as they are babies, 1-year-old, they get antibiotics. And what happens is when they're so young and while they're growing, their body, when they really need an antibiotic, will not be able to fight what they have to fight against any kind of germs or any kind of infection. So basically what we're bringing kids not to be immune to all kind of germs in our society. So what I think is we have to stop giving children and let them grow and for the body to develop its own immune system against all those things, and we don't have to take them every time. I mean, we have a tooth pain or infection from a cat or whatever, things like that.
So the researcher that I mentioned, Dr. Martin Blazer at NYU Langone, agrees with you. One of the prescriptions at the end of his book is that to the degree possible, parents should try to delay their children's first doses of antibiotics, precisely so that they won't interfere with the adaptation of the immune system to the environment. So thank you for your comment.
Thanks.
Anyone over here? I don't see any more hands? No more hands?
I think we're at.
Oh, no, one more hand. Okay. Stephen, I think this is our last question.
Yeah.
So-
Okay, you had mentioned human antibiotics, and I know on labels, sometimes it will say no human antibiotic used. But there's a lot of antibiotics that are used only for animals. Can you talk a little bit about that? How many antibiotics are used just for animals, and can they get away with saying no human antibiotics, that you think there's no antibiotics, but there's really antibiotics?
Good point. Well, if you can talk about Purdue, are they using any?
No.
So,
They're not. No, yes, I can talk about it, but no, they're not using it. So the main point here is that, you know, the most important reason to reduce antibiotic use in livestock is to slow down the generation of resistant bacteria that will be a threat to humans because we have taken away the power of the antibiotics that we would use to treat an infection. Therefore, you know, things like penicillin, streptomycin, the tetracyclines being used in animals is bad because those are antibiotics that we would have prescribed to us against infections. That's, you know, human antibiotics or human use antibiotics that's what that's shorthand for. There are other categories of antibiotics that are used in animal agriculture that those antibiotics are not used, they're not approved by the FDA for use in humans. And therefore, whether resistance develops or not is kind of irrelevant because we would never need that drug. We would never be able to use that drug. The best real-world example of this is a class of drugs called Ionophores, which are used in, they're a growth promoter in cattle. But in chickens, they are used to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce the incidence of a parasitic disease called coccidiomycosis, which basically, it's a parasite that takes up residence in the gut and causes bleeding lesions in the gut that can be a doorway for other infection to start up and ruin a chicken's its uptake of nutrition. When the European Union banned growth promoter antibiotics in 2006, they kicked the can down the road for antibiotics, for ionophores, for at least 10 years, precisely because they thought they weren't a human health risk. In the United States, where the biggest movement against antibiotics, as David said, has been in the chicken companies, Purdue went fully antibiotic-free right away, but Tyson, which is bigger than Purdue, initially said, we're going to take out human-use antibiotics, but we're going to keep ionophores because we can't figure out how to do production at our scale without them. They subsequently went further and took out ionophores as well. If you look at the policies of some of the fast food companies that are buying chicken, some of them, like, I'm not sure that McDonald's, I don't know, what does the report card say? Some of the companies are buying fully no antibiotics ever chicken. Some of the companies are contracting for no human use antibiotics, but they're allowing ionophores in their suppliers.
Basically, the driver behind what you just heard is that whether it's the Purdue's or the retail companies like McDonald's, they find it really hard to communicate the nuances to the public of what the difference is between medically and non-medically important. So some of them just flat out say, it's easier for us just to do no antibiotics ever, because it's easier to communicate. Regardless of what you think about the other reasons, that's kind of their thinking. Thank you.